Hi, this is Scott Miller. Welcome to my Top Performance blog. I have the pleasure of speaking today to Dr. Stephen Bacon. I am of late become quite acquainted with him and his work, and in particular a new book that is just about to be released called Practicing Psychotherapy in Constructed Reality, Ritual, Charisma, and Enhancing Client Outcomes. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Scott.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Quite the pleasure.
I really appreciated it when you sent me an advance copy of the manuscript for your book. Can you sort of lay some background and just tell the listeners why you might have sent it to me? What was going on? What were you thinking? What was a stimulus?
Well, you had just come out with a something in your blog about working with different approaches that weren't entirely empirical,
Right.
and you talked about mentalism actually, and so I recognized that you were moving in a different direction that complemented some of the other work that you'd done earlier, and I thought that my work might speak to one angle of what you've been referring to.
Well, it not only spoke at an angle, it really cut straight to the heart. And so before we let the cat out of the bag and tell people why this book I think is so important, tell us a little bit about yourself. What brings you to this point where you're writing a book with this title?
Well, I'm a regular clinical psychologist, just with a general practice, and been doing that for a long time. But I think probably it's my longer background that brought me in this direction.
Hmm.
I spent 6 years in an ashram in my 20s and did a lot of work with Eastern thought and that kind of philosophy. That sort of primed me
Yeah.
for my entrance as a psychologist. I
Hmm.
have a degree in religious studies, not so much theology, but phenomenology of religion.
Mm-hmm.
That was really important in writing this book. So I'm
Okay.
not really talking about a New Age background, more of a lot of it's iconoclastic, like Krishnamurti, who I don't know if you know who he is,
Yes, of
but
course.
yeah, he was one of my neighbors in Ojai, which is just down the road from Santa Barbara. And he was always asking everybody not to take things for granted. So I come more from that spiritual tradition than anything more new age.
Okay. And give us the major thrust of that work. What's it saying? What's its chief argument?
Well, the chief argument begins with this idea of whether techniques have inherent power.
Hmm.
And since you and your colleagues have done a lot of the work on that,
Hmm.
that's old news to you and to the people who've read your material. But it's not old news to psychology. Psychology is fundamentally based on the idea that we're a science, that we're a science in the way that physics and engineering is a science,
Right.
that we operate in fundamental reality, that is in a concrete, material, realistic world,
Hmm.
and that we can derive and discover techniques that will solve mental health problems. It was always clear to me, even before I became a psychologist, that psychotherapy operates in constructed reality.
Hmm.
And constructed reality is, whether the term is that familiar or not, everybody who's been to college in the last 50 years is familiar with it. Cultural anthropology has taught us that different cultures have different social realities, that
Right.
we're all programmed into seeing the world according to the way we're brought up, and that the most important part of being human is constructed. What it means to be a good person, what it means to be feminine, masculine, the right life, and so forth and so on. Those vary so widely between cultures that we can say cultures live in different social realities. They feel as solid as fundamental reality because we all endorse each other's view of reality. So there's this social endorsement quality. And that's the beginning of my book that says psychology, standard psychology believes we're operating in fundamental reality. Psychotherapy operates in fundamental reality. Techniques have inherent power. The research simply shows that's not true.
Right.
And that's the beginning of my book. It sits there and says, If we assume we're in constructed reality, what changes? What changes about training? What changes about learning from experience? Most importantly, what changes so we can have better outcomes with clients?
And so this idea that techniques in and of themselves have no inherent power. So whether it's moving your fingers back and forth or tapping on people or talking to an empty chair, confronting their dysfunctional thoughts, so to speak, that idea often causes a tremendous crisis of faith in many practitioners when they can't quite believe it. If you can't find the power of the technique nowadays in the brain, then somehow it can't be useful, can't be helpful, can't be real. And your idea provides some kind of bridge for people to cross, maintaining the faith in the potency of the structure or beliefs. Can you say more about that? How it might help us, what it does change for us when we put technique in that realm of constructed reality?
Well, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent to answer that question, if that's it,
Okay, good enough.
because I want to make sure the bridge to me comes out of the Stroop and Hadley study. And I think this is really important place to start to answer your question. Stroop and Hadley, of course, was the study where they compared college professors doing therapy against licensed and experienced clinicians with normal neurotics. And as we all know, the results of that study were that the college professors were just as effective as the licensed therapists.
Right.
Right the blow to our field. And normally that's interpreted as that training isn't effective and that experience isn't effective. But I like to use that study as the beginning place for a thought experiment. And the thought experiment, I take the college professors and imagine them competing against cardiologists, and they're trying to put in a pacemaker. If we ran the study that way, it would have a completely different outcome, which is the college professors couldn't put in any pacemakers. It would be scored 100 for the cardiologists and 0 for the college professors.
Mm.
The reason for that is because cardiology has privileged knowledge. Privileged knowledge is that knowledge in a profession without which you cannot do the basic tasks of the profession. So it's experience and training and techniques, a whole conglomeration of things that it's called privilege because it's special, it's reserved for that profession. And if you aren't given that, you can't function as a cardiologist or as an engineer or as an auto mechanic or a host of other professions that would be very easy to name. But there are other professions that lack privileged knowledge. Obviously, psychotherapy is one of those professions. Otherwise, Stroop and Hadley wouldn't be possible. But also sales, leadership, education. Because in those fields, you can take a person with no specialized knowledge and they can sell something or they can lead a department in a corporation, and so forth and so on. So when you recognize that there are fields that have privileged knowledge and fields that don't, that allows you to begin to say, why does cardiology have that and psychotherapy not? And when you look at the constellation of the fields that don't have privileged knowledge, you realize they're all operating in constructed reality. So really what enables the bridge is the recognition that it's not just psychotherapy that has this issue. There are a lot of other fields, and they just happen to be some of the fields that are the highest status fields in our culture. Leadership, obviously, sales in terms of making money, and so forth. So when you recognize that we have good company with a lot of other professions, it's a little bit easier to let in this idea that we're operating in constructed reality.
And I'm sort of wondering then, where does that take the average practitioner? And that includes me, because you often hear a conclusion from the Stroop and Hadley study that, well, that means my aunt or hairdresser could be a psychotherapist. What do we say about that?
Well, that's what the research says. That a new life coach with 2 weekend workshops can get the same result as a psychotherapist with 15 years of experience. But that shouldn't dismay us, because I don't know about you, but I think I could walk in and teach a class in high school math just as well as the high school math teacher.
Hmm.
And I think I could go lead a division at a corporation after I'd worked in that division for a few weeks, as well as the other managers.
Hmm.
So it's not as dismaying as it sounds when you say my aunt could do the same therapy.
Hmm.
And by the way, your aunt actually couldn't, because she would need to do something else besides simply say, I'm going to do psychotherapy, which is she would have to be marked as a healer by something.
Right.
If I just have lunch with your aunt versus I have lunch with Scott Miller, the famous psychologist, if I have lunch with you and I'm chatting with you about my relationship with my girlfriend, you're going to have a lot bigger impact on me than your aunt would.
Okay, so you're pointing to a core idea that is also mentioned in the title of your book, which is charisma. Can you say
Right.
more about that?
Sure. Charisma, it's an easily misunderstood term, but it's pretty easy to operationalize it and define it once you look at constructed reality. Remember, in constructed reality, we're getting initiated into our own culture. And the main initiation is our parents, but then every interaction we have with every member of the culture tells us how to be a boy, how to be a girl, how to be a good boy, how to work, how to play, and so forth. All these things are taught to us. We're initiated and programmed into our social reality by every interaction. That's a basic idea of social constructionism. But constructionism also requires certain individuals to be key individuals. By key, I mean they're invested with power that's greater than the normal cultural member. So they can sit there and define what reality is. Remember, reality is fluid. Constructionism says everything's made up. So if you're a powerful, high status person, you can say, this is the way to work. This is your role in the culture. Those key individuals, which are normally parents, mentors, bosses, famous people, politicians with power, so forth, they can change both the world and my place in the world with a few sentences.
Hmm.
Charisma means a person has power to be recognized as a key individual. So it's an operationalized definition. So a therapist, of course, wants to be a key individual to his or her clients. So charisma simply means that when the client listens to the way we see reality or we're interpreting something, they recognize us as a key individual with the authority. The accumulation of charisma is how, you speak a lot in your different articles and books about poor therapists, average therapists, and superior therapists. And in constructed reality, the accumulation of charisma is what differentiates those three levels.
Hmm.
There's a few more complicated things. Obviously, some of the poor therapists use their power in negative ways and so
Right.
forth. We're talking about well-intended people
Right.
get less effective, average effective, or more effective, depending on how much charisma they accumulate. The moment that you say that being an effective therapist and getting superior outcomes is about accumulation of charisma, then certain roads and pathways open up for you
Hmm.
that are normally closed when you're in fundamental reality.
Because it doesn't really matter if you have charisma. If it's the technique that matters, then it could be delivered by a computer.
Exactly. Exactly. If the technique has power, all the power flows from that. You're famous for saying it's not what the therapist knows, it's who the therapist is. I think that's your quote. Didn't you say that?
Yeah, I think so.
And somebody else. Yeah, I think you said that.
I'm glad to
And
be
that's
remembered for that. The other things I said.
seriously, it's a good one-liner and it totally speaks to charisma.
Mm, mm. And so it sounds as though that this is something that uh, you could improve within your particular way of thinking. This is something that therapists should work on somehow.
Yeah, that's the whole second part of the book is, I identify four paths to accumulate charisma. one of which, you're not surprised to hear is deliberate practice.
Right.
But there's three other paths as well.
And so, can you say more just about those paths, either name them or just give us a glimpse of what that might look like?
Yeah, let's start with your main one of deliberate practice
Hmm.
because, um, I think everybody seeing this video understands what you mean by deliberate practice. It's the focus on where we have weak points as opposed to where we have strong points
Yeah.
are going to make us more effective.
Yes.
So the problem, of course, in psychotherapy is identifying the weak points. Because when we're in a field where everything works, it's hard to find a weak point.
Yes.
And that is really tricky.
Hmm.
Now, the good news for us is that in constructed reality, there is a geography of constructed reality. When I say it's all made up, that's literally the definition of constructionism.
Hmm.
But constructionism actually can be broken down into a geography. And when you do that, you start becoming aware of how easy it is to find people's weak points. So let me give you a simple example, because I don't want to get off on a tangent on it. So if we think of different ways of doing therapy, some ways of doing therapy, I call them Apollonian, or they're about supporting the culture as opposed to making rapid change and so forth. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a classic Apollonian therapy because it postulates that we want the conscious mind to be in control of the unconscious and feelings.
Right.
So,
And that's consistent, you're saying, with the dominant culture.
it's consistent not only with it, but with supporting the dominant culture.
Right.
There are other things that are more far out, like hypnosis, for example, or some of the Jungian stuff, or James Hillman stuff, where he does things with soul making, where he says the abyss breaks through and our soul is on the edge of everything and we have to, dive deep and become soulful. So there are different forms of psychotherapy that require different consciousness in the therapist to do them.
Hmm.
If there's some therapists, for example, that are really good at cognitive behavioral therapy, but would get uncomfortable if they started moving in the more fluid world of psychodrama, encounter groups, or hypnosis. There are other people that are really good at that fluid stuff, but if you told them to do reality therapy, where you're taking a responsible person and saying, succeed in the dominant culture, they're really shy about imposing their values on people and helping them move toward success in the dominant culture. So you can use that geography of constructed reality to identify strengths and weaknesses for deliberate practice.
And you referred to the Apollonian. Is the latter one that is more fluid Dionysian? Is that what you refer to as Dionysian?
Dionysian. Yeah,
Perfect.
psychotherapy by definition has to be Dionysian because we're the profession of change and transformation.
Hmm.
So everything that's solid by definition is our enemy.
Hmm.
That's not exactly as simple as that because we all want to build on foundations of security and so forth. But in essence, we're a Dionysian profession.
Right. These are amazingly rich ideas, and I know that there are 3 additional pathways. Let's leave those because I want people to have something to draw them to the book, and I've read them, and they are equally as compelling and also quite specific. I have 2 sort of additional questions, and the first one is related to what we've been talking about, which is once people start to enter this constructed reality, it seems like it's a consolation prize, especially for those that have entered from a strictly materialistic or secular point of view, or as you would say, Apollonian point of view, that maintaining the faith while you know at some level that your rituals may be from a materialistic perspective simply superstitious. How would you respond to that?
The question, that is the core question in constructed reality.
Hmm.
Constructed reality looks totally relative.
Hmm.
And it kind of empties us all out of a sense of solidity, purpose, and meaning. If everything's made up, why is anything any better than anything else?
Right.
And you have that nice chapter in your Heart and Soul book by Anderson something and Ogles.
Yep. Anderson and Ogles. Yep.
Yeah, there's a middle guy in there too. Anyway, they take on that exact question and they do a really nice job, and I really recommend that chapter. I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, but at any rate, basically, relativity is the biggest problem for constructionism. There's no place to stand when you're purely constructionistic. To do psychotherapy, you have to have a place to stand. You have to have some authority. You have to say to a client who's confused, go left or go right, or this is better. Most of us psychologists and psychotherapists, we take our authority in a derivative sense. We say that our authority is derived from the purpose and the inner wisdom of the client. So going back to Carl Rogers, who compared us to midwives, we're all trying to give birth or help give birth to the inner truth of each of our clients. And in that sense, our authority and our place to stand is derivative and comes from them. In that nice chapter in your book, the question was, since allegiance effects are so important, believing that the technique works makes the technique work better, how can a constructionist possibly equal the allegiance effects that more confused people have who think we're in fundamental reality? They didn't put it that way in the chapter, but. And the answer is, in truth, everybody is at least partly a constructionist. Everybody's varying their techniques all over the place to fit the client, and all of us are resting on the sense that we're helping the client move in the direction that he or she will flourish and will do better. Now, that is a simple answer, and it's the right answer. In truth, when you actually look at constructionism, you need even bigger answers than that. And I have some bigger answers in the book.
You do.
But that is the simple, and that is a true answer, and we're all doing it all the time anyway.
Stephen, if people wanted to reach out and connect with you, what would be the best way to reach you?
Probably my website, which is drstephenbacon.com. And I know you'll probably put that on the bottom because it's Dr. Dr., right? And that's probably the best way to reach out to me.
Perfect. Stephen, thanks so much for talking with me today. And once again, I think that this book, I so much enjoyed your book, Practicing Psychotherapy and Constructed Reality. Who's the publisher?
It's going to be Rowan and Littlefield.
Perfect. Again, thanks very much.
Thank you, Scott.